Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. She texted her sister, "I'll be back in 20." 32 minutes later, two bodies were found inside a quiet home in Owasso, Oklahoma. No forced entry, no witnesses, no warning. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else. And it shattered an entire family. July 17th, 2025. The weather in Owasso, Oklahoma was dry, overcast, and uneventful, a typical Thursday. For most people, the day passed like any other. But for one woman, it ended inside the walls of a place she once called home. Whitney Resendez, 38, had been living with her sister for the last 2 days. She was recently separated from her husband, a decision described by family as mutual, quiet, and without fireworks. There were no police records, no screaming matches, no restraining orders. According to everyone close to her, Whitney was calm. She was simply trying to move on. That afternoon, she got in her car just after 3:10 p.m., waved goodbye to her sister, and told her she'd be back by dinner. "I'm just running by to grab a few things," she said. Phone charger, a couple of outfits for her daughter Ava, and a folder from the home office. Nothing unusual. The drive to the old house took just under 12 minutes. By 3:29 p.m., neighbors on North 87th East Avenue spotted her silver SUV parked out front. No one saw her enter, but no one thought it was strange. She still had things there. She had every right to be there. At 3:42 p.m., Whitney's sister sent her a quick message. "Need me to grab food or wait for you?" It went unread. At 4:17 p.m., her phone still hadn't pinged back. Calls rolled to voicemail. Still, no panic. Not yet. It wasn't until just after 5 p.m. that someone on the block, an older neighbor, noticed Whitney's vehicle still sitting in the driveway, engine cold, lights off. What caught their eye was the front door. It was cracked open. At 5:12 p.m., they dialed 911. Responding officers from Owasso Police Department arrived at 5:24 p.m. They cleared the perimeter first. Nothing seemed disturbed. No windows broken, no signs of forced entry. The house was eerily still. When they entered through the slightly ajar front door, what they found inside was not a burglary. It wasn't an accident. It was a double fatality. 2 bodies, 1 male, 1 female. No struggle, no defensive wounds. A semi-automatic handgun lay near the male's right hand. Both victims were declared dead at the scene. Whitney was identified through her wallet and vehicle registration. Her body lay partially in the hallway between the living room and the master bedroom, with 2 gunshot wounds to the torso. There was no immediate sign of resistance, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest she'd even raised her hands. The second body, male, was found nearby, sitting upright against the hallway wall. He had a single gunshot wound to the head. There was no note, no shell casings out of place, no smeared blood suggesting movement. Just static, clinical violence, fast, final, and chilling. Forensics began processing the scene by 6:03 p.m. Initial observations showed the door lock wasn't damaged, suggesting Whitney either used her own key or someone had left it unlocked. The television in the living room was off. A reusable grocery bag was on the floor near her side, still half-zipped, with a few folded shirts and paperwork sticking out. Detectives logged the first anomalies quickly. Whitney's phone was found screen up on the kitchen counter. The screen was still on when recovered, open to a draft message. "Done and heading back." Timestamp, 3:46 p.m. It was never sent. That message would later become the cornerstone of the forensic timeline. It's important to understand something here. This wasn't a crime scene soaked in chaos. There was no shouting reported, no glass shattered, no broken doors. That was part of what made it so unsettling. One officer described the environment as quiet to the point of insult. Within hours, the house was locked down for full evidence processing. No third party was believed to be involved at that point. Still, detectives withheld the male's identity from public release pending next of kin notifications. Outside the yellow tape, word began to spread. Neighbors gathered in clusters, confused and shaken. No one could understand how Whitney, a woman described by every friend and coworker as kind, organized, and meticulous, had ended her day this way. One neighbor whispered to a reporter, She just wanted to pick up her daughter's backpack. That's all. By nightfall, the sun had set over the cul-de-sac, but the forensic floodlights stayed on. What made this case difficult, and what continues to haunt those who followed it, is how little warning there was. No one expected this. There were no police calls, no accusations of abuse, no whispers among friends. There were no footprints outside, no other fingerprints on the weapon. And yet, Whitney was dead, and so was the man beside her. Why? And why did it happen just 32 minutes after she walked through the door? Before the headlines, before the sealed crime scene on North 87th East Avenue, before the unread text message time-stamped at 3:46 p.m., there was Whitney Resendez, and she was very much alive. In the days following her death, investigators began a secondary line of inquiry, the reconstruction not of the crime scene, but of Whitney's personal life, not speculation, verifiable data points. Her digital footprint, financial activity, phone records, workplace logs, and known associates were all pulled into review. What emerged wasn't the portrait of someone living in fear. It was the picture of a woman managing quiet transition. Whitney had been living with her older sister since July 15, 2025, 2 days prior to her death. She had not filed for divorce, but according to her close contacts, the separation was real. Temporary, possibly, but real. There was no indication she expected danger in returning to the residence on the 17th. That detail would become one of the most scrutinized in the entire case. Her sister confirmed to law enforcement that Whitney had packed light when she moved in, a single duffel, toiletries, and her daughter's summer clothing. Ava, 13, had stayed with them during those 2 nights. Investigators obtained device data showing Whitney's phone was connected to her sister's home Wi-Fi for approximately 41 hours before disconnecting at 3:11 p.m. on the 17th. She left shortly after. In terms of employment, Whitney worked remotely for a regional travel firm. Her last work-related activity was logged at 12:07 p.m. on the day of her death. Email metadata confirmed a routine exchange regarding a campground scheduling system. No indications of stress, escalation, or concern. Social media posts from July 16th included a shared meme about iced coffee and a comment on a friend's hiking photos. There were no indirect warnings, no cryptic messages, no activity suggesting distress. Her browser history showed searches for cabin rentals in Arkansas, a shopping cart left open on a glamping gear site, and several bookmarked recipes. One of the investigating detectives noted privately, "We've seen situations where the victim anticipates something and leaves behind subtle signs. That's not what this is. Whitney's last 48 hours looked like a woman prepping for a new routine, not a funeral." Financial data showed nothing erratic. She made a small grocery purchase on the 16th, filled her gas tank on the morning of the 17th, and made a mobile payment for a haircut scheduled for the weekend. She did not withdraw cash nor transfer funds between accounts. Of particular interest was her parenting dynamic. Whitney and her husband had no open custody dispute. Ava's school records showed both parents listed as authorized guardians. Investigators followed up with school staff. No behavioral flags, no counselor reports. Ava was reportedly well-adjusted. There were no documented domestic disturbances tied to either parent. One key interview came from Whitney's longtime friend, who told detectives, "She wasn't scared of him. She just needed space." That's how she put it. "I need air." That's what she said. The phrase was logged into the case report. "I need air," not "I need protection," not "I feel unsafe." The distinction mattered. It changed how law enforcement initially approached the investigation. Her phone data revealed no emergency searches, no self-help forums, no inquiries about protection orders. In fact, Whitney had set a delivery notification for Ava's upcoming school supplies, scheduled to arrive on July 21st, 4 days after she died. If she feared anything, it didn't show. Whitney's calendar on her device included a Thursday reminder. Return to house, grab Ava's shoes, documents, USB drive. That was the visit. That's all she intended to do. And that's what she did. She entered the house sometime around 3:17 p.m. Forensic doorframe readings showed no forced entry and no manipulation of the deadbolt. Her key was still in her purse when it was recovered. Somewhere between stepping inside and 3:45 p.m. she was killed. In cases like this, victimology matters, not because it can prevent the crime, but because it can clarify context. Whitney was not careless. She had not ignored warnings. There were no warnings to begin with. That's what made it difficult, not just for law enforcement, but for the public trying to process the unthinkable. A woman with no known enemies, no signs of domestic conflict, no reckless behaviors, gunned down inside her own home in broad daylight, with her daughter waiting for her return just across town. From a procedural standpoint, investigators classified Whitney's lifestyle as low-risk victim profile. It was the kind of term that, when used in hindsight, always sounded hollow. But for case files and clarity, it was important. The truth was, Whitney Resendez lived like most people do, predictably. Clean records, fixed routines, no history of threats, altercations, or police intervention. Yet somehow, in the span of 32 minutes, she ended up as the victim in a closed-scene fatal shooting. And law enforcement still didn't know why. From the first moment investigators stepped through the doorway at 87th East Avenue, the silence struck them harder than the visual evidence. It wasn't the absence of sound that unsettled them. It was the absence of disruption. The door wasn't broken. Nothing was overturned. The house hadn't been burglarized or ransacked. It was as if the air had been holding still long before the crime ever occurred. As the forensic team began processing the scene on July 17, 2025, the first priority was securing perimeter integrity. Entry logs and timestamps were critical. The front door was slightly ajar when first responders arrived at 5:12 p.m. There were no pry marks, no kicked-in hinges, and no tampered locks. Crime scene technicians recovered Whitney Resendez's house key from inside her purse, which was found zipped and placed near the kitchen counter. The lock mechanism showed no force contact. Investigators concluded that she had used her own key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside willingly. The living room was undisturbed. A folded blanket on the couch remained untouched. Mail sat unopened on a side table. The only break in order was the scene in the hallway. Whitney's body was found partially collapsed along the inner corridor between the living room and bedroom entrance. Her cell phone was retrieved from the counter nearby, still unlocked. The draft message she began composing at 3:46 p.m. was time-stamped, saved, but unsent. Done and heading back. Time of death, based on core temperature estimates and blood pooling analysis, was calculated between 3:40 and 3:47 p.m. That narrowed the fatal window to roughly 25 minutes after she likely arrived. The male victim, whose identity had not yet been released publicly, was located several feet away in a seated position against the wall. A single gunshot wound to the head was visible. His phone was not recovered from the scene. A semi-automatic handgun lay adjacent to his right hand. The gun had been discharged 3 times. Ballistic residue on both bodies matched the firearm, which was registered to the male occupant of the home. Police noted that the firearm was not reported stolen and that the serial number had not been removed or altered, an unusual fact in domestic homicide cases involving premeditation. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no evidence that Whitney had tried to flee. Blood spatter patterns indicated that she had been standing or walking when she was shot twice in the torso. Entry angles suggested a mid-range confrontation, no point-blank execution, but close enough that any attempt to run would have failed. A paper grocery bag was found on the floor near the victim. Inside were 2 folded shirts, a zippered pencil pouch, and a school binder labeled Ava. None of the items showed blood transfers. That detail became important later, during sequence mapping. Digital forensics recovered from the home's router logs confirmed that Whitney's phone connected to the home's Wi-Fi at 3:17 p.m. The last data ping from her device occurred at 3:46 p.m., coinciding precisely with the unfinished message. Outside, no security cameras were in place. No doorbell system was installed. Neighboring homes had limited visibility of the entrance, and no one reported hearing gunfire. Weather conditions were calm, and according to nearby residents, traffic was low during the early afternoon hours. Fingerprints at the scene were limited. Investigators located latent prints on the doorknobs, refrigerator handle, and parts of the hallway wall. All were attributed to the 2 individuals already identified. No unknown third-party DNA was found. No shoe prints, no glove imprints, no external interference. Detectives privately noted that the scene was too self-contained, meaning it lacked variables often present in spontaneous violence. There were no signs of panic, no call for help, no property moved or displaced in haste. It felt precise, like the sequence had followed a plan no one else knew existed. That raised a new line of thought. Had this meeting been prearranged? And if so, why did it end in gunfire within a 30-minute window? One investigator raised a quiet concern in the internal briefing. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't a messy fight gone wrong. It was execution-level quiet. But what hadn't been determined yet, what still kept the file open, was intent. Was this a double homicide? A murder-suicide? A confrontation gone wrong? The answer depended on understanding motive. And as of July 18, 2025, detectives didn't have that. They had a sealed house, 2 bodies, 1 legally owned weapon, and a timeline that refused to give up its meaning. The morning of July 17, 2025 began unremarkably for neighbors on North 109th East Avenue in Owasso, Oklahoma. Summer cicadas buzzed in the background. Lawn sprinklers ticked methodically across driveways. But behind the closed doors of one modest home, something irreversible was set in motion. Whitney Resendez, 38, had returned to the residence she'd once shared with her husband Eric, now estranged, to retrieve a few personal belongings. According to family sources, she had moved out just 2 days prior. The split wasn't dramatic or hostile. There were no police reports, no history of domestic calls, and no obvious red flags. At least none that anyone could point to in hindsight. Whitney's visit that morning was supposed to be quick, procedural, nothing more. We now know it was her last. The timeline narrowed sharply based on digital and forensic evidence. Security cameras from neighboring properties captured Whitney's SUV pulling into the driveway at approximately 10:14 a.m. No one exited the home after that. Her phone ceased activity by 10:28 a.m., a detail investigators flagged immediately. Calls and texts from her sister and daughter later that afternoon went unanswered. What disturbed investigators most wasn't just the absence of activity, but the eerie silence that followed. A welfare check was only triggered because a concerned family member, Whitney's cousin, had grown uneasy by nightfall. She drove to the house, knocked, and saw Whitney's car still parked. After multiple unanswered calls, she contacted Owasso police. Officers entered the home at approximately 8:46 p.m. with the cousin's consent. Inside, they discovered Whitney's body on the floor of the primary bedroom. The cause of death was immediately apparent, a single gunshot wound to the upper chest. Lying nearby was Eric Resendez, deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. A 9mm semi-automatic handgun was found between them, still chambered. No note, no struggle, no signs of forced entry or disarray. The scene was clean but cold. As one officer later stated in the incident log, it looked like he'd waited, like he knew she was coming. Eric had not contacted anyone that day. No digital footprint, no call logs. His browser history in the days prior was largely dormant, except for one telling search conducted 2 nights before. How to shoot yourself in the chest or head. The detail was flagged in the police narrative, but not released publicly at the time due to the open nature of the investigation. In retrospect, it marked the chilling moment the story turned from unexplained silence to premeditation. Neighbors interviewed later by local media reported nothing out of the ordinary. No yelling, no raised voices. Nothing that would have drawn suspicion until the flashing lights arrived. From a forensic standpoint, the medical examiner's office confirmed time of death for both parties within a 30-minute window, suggesting the murder-suicide occurred not long after Whitney arrived. There were no signs of a second shooter, and the ballistic trajectory matched a close-range discharge from the recovered firearm. As investigators began reconstructing the hours and minutes leading up to Whitney's death, they also faced a grim realization. There had been no previous signs of physical abuse, no protective orders, no visible escalation. Sometimes violence doesn't roar, it waits. But what might compel a man like Eric, with no prior history of aggression, to execute such a devastating act? That question would linger in the next phase of the investigation. No one thought July 17th would be the day that rewrote an entire family's future. But by midday, Whitney Resendez, 38 years old, mother to a 13-year-old daughter, and by all accounts a kind, attentive, and deeply loyal woman, was dead, shot inside her Owasso home. The person who pulled the trigger, her estranged husband, Eric Resendez. This was not a disappearance. This was not a prolonged investigation. There was no chase, no missing persons alert, no cryptic text message. It was blunt, immediate, final, and perhaps most terrifying, there were no signs, no known history of domestic abuse, no pending restraining orders, no erratic behavior documented by police. That absence of warning became its own kind of horror. Authorities received the 911 call just after noon from a third party, an individual who arrived at the scene expecting a routine favor, only to discover two bodies and a locked silence. Responding officers with the Owasso Police Department entered a one-story residential home in a well-kept suburban neighborhood. Inside the entryway hallway, Whitney's body was found with a single gunshot wound to the upper torso. Eric's body was located nearby. The weapon, a legally owned handgun, was recovered at the scene. The timeline left little ambiguity. The medical examiner's office later confirmed that Whitney died almost instantly. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. She had re-entered the home to retrieve personal items following a recent, quiet separation, only 2 days prior. Investigators determined that she likely did not anticipate violence. Her car was parked as if she expected to leave quickly. Her cell phone was found unlocked on the kitchen counter, mid-conversation with a friend. Her purse was still zipped. There were no text messages, no voicemails, no journals outlining fear. Inside the house, officers found nothing to suggest escalating tension. The scene was not disordered. There were no broken items, no overturned furniture. That absence told its own story. This was not a murder fueled by an argument spiraling out of control. This was planned, quick, controlled, a decision made in isolation. The autopsy on Eric Resendez confirmed a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Gunshot residue on his right hand and fingerprints on the weapon matched. There was no suicide note, no written explanation, no message left for his daughter. Toxicology showed no presence of alcohol or illicit drugs. According to his employer, Eric had not missed work. He had made a grocery run just days earlier. His online accounts remained active until the day of the murder. But here's where the story fractures into something far more unsettling. Eric had no criminal record, no prior arrests, no known threats. He was, by most outward appearances, an average suburban husband. Friends described him as quiet, responsible, sometimes withdrawn, but never aggressive. Even close family members said they had no inkling of instability or resentment brewing. He had attended Ava's last school recital. He had helped a neighbor repair a fence the previous week. And yet, in less than 3 minutes, Eric pulled the trigger twice. Once toward Whitney, once toward himself. The reason remains unstated. But one thing is clear: silence does not equal safety. Investigators scoured Eric's digital history. His computer was powered down. His phone was locked with biometric security. What little data was available didn't suggest obsession, stalking, or surveillance. No online purchases of weapons. No search history related to violence or separation. Detectives did note one small flag. Eric had visited a website on firearm maintenance less than a week before the shooting. Still, that alone wasn't enough to constitute a red flag. And that's the problem law enforcement often faces in domestic murder-suicides. When there's no trail of prior abuse, no signs of control, and no formal complaints, there's no leverage for early intervention. In a press briefing 2 days after the incident, the Owasso Police Department emphasized that this appears to be an isolated domestic event, but they also admitted the limitations of their system. "We had no prior contact with this family," one officer noted. There were no previous calls, no reported disturbances. No one saw this coming. And Ava, 13 years old, now motherless, was not home at the time. She had stayed with relatives the night before. That logistical detail spared her from the physical scene, but it placed her in a new life she never consented to. Her father was her killer. Her mother, his victim. The aftermath wasn't just emotional, it was practical too. A GoFundMe page launched by extended family quickly garnered donations for Ava's future, but no amount of money can rewrite the moment she will forever live with. July 17th was the day her life cleaved into before and after. As the public tried to make sense of the event, one quiet fact stood out. This was not a failure of the system because the system was never called. It was a reminder that domestic violence doesn't always wear visible scars and danger doesn't always knock before it enters. They say the most dangerous moment is when you think it's finally over. On the morning of July 17, 2025, Whitney Resendez drove toward her former home in Owasso, Oklahoma. The separation was only 2 days old. She wasn't planning to stay, just to retrieve a few personal items, a box of clothes, her hiking boots, a forgotten charger. Nothing about the plan sounded alarming. Nothing sounded final. But investigators now believe that Eric Resendez had already decided how this story would end. Whitney's entry into the home was unforced. There were no signs of a break-in or struggle at the threshold, but inside, the atmosphere shifted rapidly. The living room bore no marks of disorder, no overturned furniture. But near the hallway leading to the master bedroom, police noted drag marks on the carpet, subtle but deliberate, the kind that suggested movement after an act of violence had occurred. Forensics recovered a single spent .380 shell casing just outside the bedroom. The bullet had entered Whitney's left upper chest and exited through the lower right shoulder blade, consistent with a downward angle and close-range trajectory. Autopsy findings confirmed no defensive wounds, indicating she had little to no time to react. This wasn't an argument turned deadly. It was a calculated ambush. Eric's body was found a few feet away, partially slumped against the nightstand. His weapon, a compact Ruger handgun registered in his name, lay between them. GSR, gunshot residue, was present on his hands. The trajectory of his own self-inflicted wound, through the right temple, was consistent with suicide. There were no signs of hesitation marks. Detectives later reconstructed the scene. Whitney likely stepped into the bedroom unprepared, expecting to collect items. Eric, according to the medical examiner's timeline, fired within minutes of her arrival. He made no call for help, no effort to disguise the scene, just silence. A premeditated end. Yet what made this case uniquely disturbing was what wasn't found. No suicide note, no manifesto, no text messages, drafts, or voice recordings. The Digital Forensics Unit confirmed there were no prior threats, no history of violent exchanges via email, text, or social platforms. Investigators pulled months of data. Nothing surfaced. Family and friends were equally blindsided. Whitney had confided in close circles that she and Eric were working through space. No one reported controlling behavior, no accusations of abuse. In fact, his criminal and psychological history returned clean. No priors, no restraining orders, not even a noise complaint. To those who knew them, the word murder-suicide didn't compute. This wasn't the escalation of a known threat. This was the emergence of a hidden one. Some theories floated in the investigation. A control dynamic unspoken. A possessiveness masked as passivity. But with Eric gone, the evidence would never testify beyond the bloodstains. Still, questions loom. Why the sudden break? Why didn't Whitney tell anyone she felt unsafe? And most importantly, why did Eric choose that moment to end everything? Law enforcement concluded there were no co-conspirators, no external triggers. This was an isolated domestic event, rooted in emotional concealment. The Department of Mental Health later issued a public advisory reinforcing the warning signs of silent coercive control, emotional abuse that may not register as abuse until it's too late. The aftermath left Whitney's 13-year-old daughter, Ava, without either parent. A GoFundMe campaign was quickly organized by relatives to support Ava's care and education, with community support pouring in across Owasso and beyond. But grief carries its own accounting system. No dollar amount softens its toll. Some viewers may wonder, could anything have been done? The honest answer? Not with the data available beforehand. This was not a case of ignored red flags, it was a case of no flags at all. Owasso, Oklahoma, July 2025. Whitney Resendez's final day began like any other, ordinary enough to disarm. She had left her temporary residence that morning and returned to the family home on East 86th Street North in Owasso to retrieve a few personal items. The decision wasn't impulsive. According to texts found later on her phone, she had arranged the brief stop with her teenage daughter Ava in mind. Whitney was cautious. She told her sister she wouldn't stay long. but the evidence indicates something changed between her arrival and the moment shots were fired. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline with unusual precision. Based on ring camera footage from a neighboring property and cellular tower pings, Whitney arrived at 1:14 p.m. She parked her vehicle in the driveway and entered the home using her old key. What she didn't know, or couldn't have expected, was that Eric Resendez was already inside. He had disconnected the smart doorbell from the Wi-Fi earlier that morning. This wasn't a careless oversight, it was premeditated. Authorities would later confirm he had disabled the router manually at 7:03 a.m., based on router log data. With the home's surveillance system down and blinds drawn, the interior became an isolated zone, cut off from digital record. The coroner's preliminary report places Whitney's time of death at approximately 1:21 p.m., with a .38 caliber gunshot wound to the chest listed as the fatal injury. 2 additional wounds, one to her abdomen and another to her shoulder, were consistent with close-range fire based on gunpowder residue found on her blouse. Eric's body was found several feet away from hers, slumped beside a revolver. The bullet that ended his life was self-inflicted, entering beneath the chin and exiting through the occipital lobe. He died instantly. Crime scene investigators identified only 2 sets of prints on the weapon. Whitney's were absent. No suicide note was recovered at the scene. However, an unsecured laptop on the kitchen counter revealed a web search history of interest. Cached queries in the days leading up to the murder included: how to shoot without hesitation, is murder-suicide common in divorce, Owasso police response time, can cell phones record if Wi-Fi is off. Digital forensic analysts retrieved fragments of a deleted Word document on the same laptop. The file had been autosaved multiple times under different names: custody plan, July 17 notes, and finally, letter for Ava. While corrupted and incomplete, some lines could still be parsed. She left me no choice. She broke the family. I want Ava to understand. This was not an act of passion. This was staged isolation, an ambush under the illusion of reconciliation. According to an Owasso Police Department interview with a friend of Eric's, he had spoken cryptically about losing everything in the days prior. The friend had shrugged it off as divorce stress. No one suspected violent intent. No reports of domestic violence had ever been filed. No neighbors had called 911. The couple's public record was, by all accounts, clean. But beneath that facade, there was pressure. Whitney had been speaking with a divorce attorney since late June. Her lawyer later confirmed she had formally requested full custody of Ava and submitted preliminary paperwork for financial separation. While Eric had agreed verbally to the separation, he had refused to leave the house. The motive, investigators now believe, may have been rooted in perceived loss of control, both over Whitney and over the shared image of their family. In interviews conducted after the incident, multiple friends of Whitney described her as being on edge the last few days before her death. She hadn't articulated any direct threats, but she had begun making copies of key documents and looking into storage units for her belongings. Why she went to the house alone remains the final unanswerable question. Some speculate that she underestimated him, trusted that the man she once married would never go that far. But the gun, the disconnected router, and the search history suggest he planned otherwise. Whitney Resendez was 38 years old. She was a mother, a traveler, a volunteer at local shelters, and someone who brought comfort to those around her. Her daughter, Ava, was her priority and remains at the center of the family's focus. Today, a memorial stands outside the Owasso residence. The curtains have been drawn for good, but the questions remain. How do we detect danger in silence? What systems exist to protect women who don't yet know they're at risk? And how many more families will be blindsided before those systems evolve? By the time officers cleared the scene on East 86th Street North in Owasso, Oklahoma, the reality had already begun to ripple beyond the yellow tape. Whitney Resendez was gone. The 38-year-old mother of one, warm-hearted, outdoorsy, meticulous in every detail of her life, had been shot dead by her estranged husband, Eric Resendez, who then turned the gun on himself. The house, once shared, became the last witness to a final act of control disguised as despair. No warning signs, no history of violence, no 911 calls. Nothing, until the final moment. In the days that followed, Whitney's family organized her funeral quietly. There was no press conference, no victim statement read in court, because there would be no trial. Eric had made sure of that. What remained was a haunting silence. Her 13-year-old daughter, Ava, now lives with relatives. A GoFundMe campaign was launched by family friends to provide Ava with financial stability, education, therapy, and day-to-day support. Within days, the page gathered thousands in donations, along with hundreds of messages. Most were from strangers who had never met Whitney, but felt they knew her through the headlines. The autopsy results confirmed what the police had suspected: a single gunshot wound to Whitney's chest at close range. No signs of defensive wounds. The implication: she never had a chance to react. The angle and residue pattern suggested she was facing him. Eric's gunshot was self-inflicted, fired seconds later. The weapon, a registered handgun, was legally owned. There were no notes left behind. No manifesto, just the aftermath. Law enforcement was forced to answer a pressing question: how could this happen in a home with no documented history of abuse? A veteran Tulsa County investigator put it bluntly: not all threats leave bruises. Some hide behind silence, behind a smile, behind a good job and no criminal record. In their review, police confirmed that the Resendez household had no prior reports, no calls to police, no restraining orders, no visits from social workers. It's precisely this absence of visible red flags that makes these types of domestic homicides harder to predict. A neighbor told local media, "They looked like a normal couple. Nothing ever seemed wrong. But behind closed doors, normal is a dangerous mask." Whitney's death became a quiet catalyst. In Owasso, several local domestic violence resources saw an uptick in calls within a week. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation used the opportunity to remind residents: emotional abuse, financial control, isolation. These are warning signs, even if unreported. National helplines also shared updated guidelines on how to recognize high-risk post-separation behavior, especially among couples going through divorce or custody transitions. Still, the broader question lingered. If there were no signs, no signals, then what failed Whitney? The reality is sobering. Intimate partner homicide often escalates during periods of separation. According to the CDC, more than 50% of women killed by intimate partners are murdered within 3 months of leaving. Whitney was killed just 2 days after moving out. The pattern is tragically familiar. It plays out in countless cases across the U.S., a fatal intersection of possessiveness, fear of abandonment, and unchecked control. But statistics don't grieve. People do. Friends remember Whitney not just for her passion for glamping and travel, but for her generosity. She made people feel seen, cared for. Even in death, that imprint remains. She would have wanted her story to help someone else, a longtime friend wrote in a tribute post, and perhaps it already has. The GoFundMe page became not just a fundraising tool, but a space where survivors, widows, and daughters left behind could speak. An informal record of collective loss, of warnings not taken seriously, of systems still catching up. There will be no court transcripts, no appeals, no sentence served. Eric's act silenced justice the moment he pulled the trigger. But Whitney's story survives. If there's one thing this tragedy taught me, it's that silence isn't always safety, and love, without respect or self-control, can turn deadly. I used to think danger always came with warning signs, but sometimes it comes with a smile, a routine, and the lie that everything's fine. If you or someone you know is quietly struggling in a relationship, please don't wait for things to get louder. Seek help. Check in on friends going through separation. Trust your gut, even when there are no bruises. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you or someone you care about ever experienced a situation where the danger wasn't visible until it was too late? Or maybe you've learned a lesson in hindsight that others should hear. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's turn this platform into a space for awareness, healing, and connection. If this video moved you or made you reflect, let me know where you're watching from, or even if it challenged you in some way. And hey, if you didn't like it, I'd still love to hear why. Every perspective helps us grow. Drop your thoughts below, hit like if you found value here, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that matter, because sometimes just listening can save a life.